Americans care a lot about the national debt, even more than I realized. In a recent poll, more than 80% said they're concerned about how huge the debt is getting. Makes sense. It's at about $37 trillion now. So it's no surprise that in all the battles over the so-called One Big Beautiful Act, you kept hearing stuff like this in the news.
You go from a $2 to $3 trillion deficit to a $2 to $3 trillion surplus.
That this big, beautiful betrayal of the American people adds $4 trillion in debt.
The reality is this adds $3.8 trillion to the national debt.
In addition to adding $3.3 trillion to the national debt.
Those clips don't follow the predicted media breakdown, by the way. Actually, one of the larger estimates you heard in there was something said on Fox. And one talking about a surplus came from part of NBC News. I'll explain coming up. I wanted to fact check all this for you. What will this law really do to the debt? I also have a bunch of other questions about it and how it will affect you. Today, I'm going to take you through what I found on this and the most obvious things that the media should be telling you, which they aren't. That includes Trump's track record. And then something I've been looking forward to bringing you for a while. In a way, it is a perfect follow-up to something I reported on last week, a dangerous anti-democratic threat from New York City's Democratic mayoral nominee. How did we get here as a society? How did anti-democratic movements based on lies become so popular? There is a brilliant guy with deep understanding of how cultures change who will join me today. I talked to him about what we can all do to turn our society toward truth. That, plus your awesome responses to recent episodes and more, coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. What a week it has been. So much to tell you all about. Oh, for those of you who are new, hi, I'm Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact checks the news. You can see my bio, learn more about me at my website, joshlebs.com. Short version is I spent 20 years on mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN. I was fact checking on air at CNN, and throughout all that time, I saw that there's an industry in America that desperately needs fact checking. The media, the mainstream media. And no one was doing that until now. I don't expect you to take my word for anything I say, so I offer you tons of links and information. You can check out what I'm talking about in the newsletter, which is free, and it comes along with this show. Or just check out the links in the show notes or my website, or if you're already on something called Substack, just look for They Stand Corrected. And I have additional content for paid subscribers. They are the reason this show can exist. Let's see, as I record this, the latest new paid subscriber to include a note is Florence Calvert, and she wrote, "So appreciate your facts and fact-checking." Oh, thank you. I appreciate you. I will tell you, your responses to last week's episode have been amazing, and I'm going to talk about that more later on in the show. But for now, let's jump right into this, because we got something to dig into here. The so-called One Big Beautiful Act. It is huge. Actually, different news agencies are giving different numbers of pages for how big it is, probably because they're opening all that text in different platforms. Anyway, One Big Beautiful is the actual name. It's not me describing it because it's so dense. I am going to be looking into more and more how it will affect your life. I'm starting off today with the thing that you probably heard and read and saw the most about, and that is the impact on the national debt. There's a reason this gets so much attention. It is something that the majority of Americans say they are concerned about. I was looking at survey data about this. Over the last few years, Americans have gotten more and more concerned about it. In a recent Gallup poll, 53% of Americans said they're very concerned about the debt, and another 28% said they're somewhat concerned. It was only a tiny sliver of Americans who said they're not concerned about it, only 6%. Don't worry about those numbers. If you're new to this show, you should know I've explained that in broadcasting, you never expect people to hold on to numbers. They don't need to. When I give you numbers, it's just to help you get the big picture. You can always see the facts and figures in the newsletter if you want them. Okay, so at the top, you heard these different figures for what this law will do to the national debt. You heard CNN saying it will add $3.3 trillion to the debt. On Fox News Sunday, Representative Rohit Khanna, a Democrat, used the 3.8 trillion figure. On MSNBC, Senator Amy Klobuchar, also a Democrat, used the $4 trillion figure. Meanwhile, on CNBC, Peter Navarro, an advisor to Trump, was arguing that this bill will actually lead to a surplus of a couple trillion. Sometimes when these numbers differ in the news, it's because agencies that run these numbers were looking at different versions of the bill. You know, bills keep changing as they go through the House and the Senate. But the different figures are also the result of the fact that there are different groups out there that estimate what it will do. So I started looking into track records of these groups. There are too many groups for me to name here. It would sound like a word salad of Washington think tank lingo if I listed them all. But the one you hear about most is not a think tank in the usual sense. It's part of the government. It's a nonpartisan agency within the government, the Congressional Budget Office, which has a mandate and is supposed to look independently at legislation and do the best job it can analyzing. I have been checking with the CBO. Their projection, as of right now, is that this law will increase the debt by $3.4 trillion by the year 2034. All right. And that's $3.4 trillion more than what would have happened under the laws as they were before Trump signed this bill. So that's their estimate. They've been doing this for a long time. How good is the CBO's track record? They publish reports about that, and their track record seems to be pretty impressive. For the first year after they make a prediction, and all the way up through the 6th year after that legislation is passed, their projections have been close to what actually happened. Focusing on debt, their own analysis found that when you look 6 years out after a bill, their average error, so the difference between what they projected and what happened, was 0.2% of the nation's gross domestic product, GDP. So basically what that means is they were close. Now, when you look farther out by 11 years, the error is substantially more. I don't want to confuse you with numbers. Like I said, you can see these in the newsletter. But if some of you are really into this, I will tell you now, the CBO says that when it comes to 11 years out, their projections for the debt have been off by about 3.5% of GDP. So bigger error there. But in the shorter term, they're close. And here's what I found as I looked into this. I don't understand how it's even possible for them or anyone to try to get a realistic assessment 11 years out. By that point, a new administration is in. Now, that's often true 6 years after something is passed, but it's always true 11 years out. So how can you look after 11 years and say, well, these things in the economy are different because of that one law? I've asked the CBO. They were not in a position to do an interview yet. They are obviously very busy, still piecing through this massive legislation and coming up with their latest analyses. But knowing that they have a good track record for those first 6 years, that is relevant for you. I also checked other organizations that do these analyses. Like, they don't seem to go back and check their own accuracy over time. I've contacted them. So far, none of them have told me that they do that. Okay. All that stuff I just said involves predictions and guesswork. As a fact checker, here's what I want you to know. There are concrete, definite things right now that the media could be telling you that really should be all over the news. And they aren't, of course. Let's start with this. Throughout the debates over this giant spending bill, the media has been filled with reports like this.
Immoral, grotesque. Those are some of the words that Republican Senator Ron Johnson has used to describe the massive tax bill President Trump has made a top priority.
That's NPR, one of the many major news outlets that kept telling you about how a bunch of powerful Republicans care so much about big spending and really want to cut back on annual deficits and debts. They're referred to by a term that invokes a fierce, cunning, some say majestic animal.
But fiscal hawks like Johnson have serious concerns about how much it would add to the federal deficit.
That term is everywhere in the media. Here's PBS speaking with Republican Congressman Chip Roy.
You are a debt and deficit hawk. Where this bill stands right now, it could add trillions to the deficit, could it not? Or how do you see it? And is it on a track you can support?
Yeah, well, we're only going to be able to support legislation that'll reduce the deficit. Otherwise, we'll be a no.
That didn't happen. Of course it didn't. It never does. Both these guys and most of the people the media calls deficit hawks aren't. I wrote a piece about this. You can see it in my newsletter. It ran at The Contrarian. This is a typical Washington exercise, and the media just props it up by pretending that it's real. People say they care about the deficit, and maybe they do, but not enough for it to show up in their votes. Almost everyone referred to as a deficit or fiscal hawk by the media recently voted for this bill. And the media should be emphasizing this. The bill raises the debt ceiling by another $5 trillion. That's the amount that the Treasury is allowed to borrow. So these folks voted to raise the debt ceiling by another $5 trillion. They have put out statements insisting that they got assurances that this law won't actually expand deficits and debts, despite all these analyses that say otherwise. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of groups. Most of them say trillions of dollars in debt. So this is a media game. By talking about these alleged hawks in the GOP, the media keeps drilling an idea into the heads of Americans that today's Republicans are more committed to fiscal conservatism, even though, and this is just numerical fact, Republican administrations spend more and rack up more debt than Democratic administrations do. It's not like the Democrats aren't spending, but the Republicans consistently spend more and rack up more debt. That keeps happening. And there's one more thing that the media should be telling you about this. These lawmakers who say they got assurances from Trump, what's Trump's track record? He was already president once. How about we look at what came of his financial promises last time? Here's one of many he made the first time around. This was a speech in 2016 in which he said he wanted 4% economic growth in the gross domestic product, the GDP, and that he thought his plan would do even better than that. And then he gave this more modest figure.
Over the next 10 years, our economic team estimates that under our plan, the economy will average 3.5% growth and create a total of 25 million new jobs. You can visit our website. Just look at the math. It works.
The math never worked. That year, he also said he would get rid of what was then a $19 trillion debt over 8 years. And he said he would get rid of the trade deficit. Then he got into office, pushed plans through, and none of those things happened. Even before COVID, 0 of those things happened. He had big deficits, the debt reached historic levels, the nation never saw that kind of GDP growth, and the trade deficit increased. How about you tell us all that, media? The president giving assurances to these alleged deficit or fiscal hawks has no credibility in doing so. And they have every reason to know that. Hawks rise above the fray and keep their eyes on their goal until they achieve it. Actually, here's some cool sound of a hawk. It is unfair to hawks to compare these lawmakers to them. In that column, I suggest that we should call these folks something else, like all talk hawks, or blue jays, because it turns out blue jays mimic hawk sounds. That's so cool. All right, that is enough with figures for you today. Our brains can now take a break from any and all numbers. And what we're going to do instead is zoom out and take a bird's eye view of how America has changed. It took fundamental change for so many people to become so radicalized by lies that what happened in New York City recently could happen. That is coming up.
Hello from coast to coast and back again. You can hear that syncopated train. It's there. You declare. Listen to the Nighthawk Blues. Tune in. Listen to the Nighthawk Blues.
The messages that listeners like you send in are amazing. Whether they're written messages that you have me read, I think the work you are doing is one of the most important causes that I've seen in quite some time. I love that I can't tell from your podcast if you are a Republican or a Democrat. I love that nobody's off limits and that you cite exactly where you see the fallacies. Or voice messages.
This show is exactly what we need at this moment in time. Josh is a passionate advocate for journalism, calls things as he sees them, and is actively working to reestablish the credibility of the profession. And we all know a strong and independent media is crucial for democracy to exist and flourish.
I really enjoy listening to your podcast. And more than that, I've really enjoyed and been thankful for your fact-driven and data-centric approach, especially during these
I just wanted to say how much I love your podcast. I really appreciate the meaningful content you share and your commitment to accuracy in journalism. It's so important to have a clear understanding of key news events and topics.
Thanks for always keeping everything real when you're informing us on your show. Good job, and keep up the good work, brother.
Thank you for your wonderful show, Based and Corrected. As someone who is surrounded by media all day, having an individual take the time to expose the outright bias and lack of credibility in media today is just wonderful to see. Keep doing what you're doing. You're inspiring the younger generation, like people like me too.
Thank you to everyone supporting this show. To submit your message, get in touch through the newsletter or the form at my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. You'll find links in the show notes. Last week, I reported on a huge story that the mainstream media has been completely ignoring, an unconstitutional threat from the man who won New York City's Democratic mayoral primary. Zohran Mamdani, a Democratic socialist, has said he would arrest the leader of a foreign country, even though he has no legal right to do so. The responses are amazing. Thank you all so much. I've been hearing from people in New York who say how frightening it is that the nation's biggest city is supporting a guy who has a terrible track record on anti-Semitism and who has refused to put out a statement just condemning Hamas, even for the October 7th, 2023 horrific massacres. How did this happen? How did we get to this point as a society? There is someone who has really helpful knowledge and insight, Jason Korman. He is CEO of a group called Gaping Void, which works with the private sector and the U.S. military to create the best workplace cultures. He understands how cultures change. He had a column in the Washington Times. Here's part of what he wrote. The day after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, Americans of various political beliefs largely stood together against Islamist terrorism. We understood that our free democratic way of life was under attack from those who seek a fascist, theocratic, global government. However, a mere 22 years later, on October 8th, 2023, an entire swath of liberal-minded people were celebrating the Hamas atrocities. They have become like those who celebrated 9/11. It is getting worse as the voices of anti-American anarchists grow louder and more violent. I know Jason. We've done a bunch of work together over the years, and I wanted to talk to him about this. There's something he understands better than anyone else I know. Memetic warfare. These days, when we hear the word meme, we think of often silly things that are going around social media. But memes can be wildly powerful. Jason tells me it's a field of science that got its name about 50 years ago.
1976, Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist, wrote a book called The Selfish Gene. And he basically proposed that humans are designed to do two things. One is create more humans, and two is share their knowledge. And he created the word meme, fashioned after gene, and memetic, fashioned after genetic. And this idea of a meme as a unit of culture or unit of knowledge was just something that he realized is the truth about the world and about all humans and all cultures.
What was a meme back then in the 70s? What would a meme have looked like?
In God we trust. Movements have always had memes, right?
Or like some of the hippie signs that you would see, those could be called memes.
Gay pride, you know.
Obama, yes, we can.
Yes, make America great again. And memes are most powerful when they're attached to visual tools. So if I say in God we trust, you're probably thinking about the pyramid on U.S. currency. And this is fundamental to branding, Nike swoosh. It's fundamental to how you get ideas to spread. And with the invention of social media and the internet, you can spread your memes into people's pockets, literally. If one is interested in changing how people think and has lots of resources and lots of time, you can actually transform entire populations at any scale. And that is what we are witnessing now. It is the gradual association of extreme philosophies that become normalized over time.
Quote unquote genocide, the genocide, that is language being used with images as memes to transform thinking.
Apartheid,
same thing. Yeah.
You know anything about apartheid, Israel's not an apartheid state.
And I told Jason there's a great column about this by a South African woman who explained how awful and offensive that comparison to apartheid is. And the term genocide being associated with the current war in Gaza, it's not a genocide. And there are much huger death tolls in other wars around the world, as I've discussed here. So how do these ideas take hold? Well, Jason explains that memes are often used to push something I've talked about here on this show, victim narratives, especially in the content that Iran puts out.
It is a classic drama triangle where there's a victim, there's a villain, and there's a hero. So in that scenario, they're the victim of Western oppression and violence, and the heroes would be the religious heads of that state.
In the newsletter, I'll put links to a few studies about this. There's one from the Air Force Institute of Technology about the use of memes. It says from this perspective, Islamist extremism might be rightly thought of as an epidemic of ideas or a social epidemic. There's another one from the National Counterterrorism Center that points to ISIS using this tactic. There's one from the Atlantic Council that points out that in January 2020, following the U.S. assassination of a top Iranian general, Iranian Instagram accounts tagged the White House and members of the Trump family with thousands of graphic anti-American images and memes. And there's an analyst who called that a digital flex intended to demonstrate the strength and volume of Iran's digital communications apparatus. And there's analysis on how this happens on the far right as well. There's one from the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. It talks about how the alt-right did pioneering work, establishing a cultural policy that combined ideas of white supremacy with digital meme, game, and hacker cultures in such a way that it provided fascist ideology with a new look or image. But you have probably seen what I've seen. There are a lot of people who complain about how social media has been used to radicalize people on the right. And a lot of the same people complaining that way have been radicalized as well, just in a different way. Let's go back to Jason.
Liberal-minded people have had their thinking processes corrupted by memetic warfare. They do not know it. And that's the thing. You have no idea that your brain has been memetically taken over.
Jason is a fan of people of different perspectives, backgrounds, all these things, having an equal shot. And he works with places to make that happen. And he writes in this piece about how a movement that may have originally been aimed at making that happen ended up causing problems. That's the DEI movement, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
The fundamental flaw with the DEI movement and DEI thinking was, let's go back to the victim triangle. It cast people as victims to a system that they have no control over, and the system is wrong them. It takes their locus of control and creates it externally and blames others for their misfortune. Now, I am not saying the world is fair. The world is not a fair place. And I am not saying that there weren't errors of the past. All those are true. But by indoctrinating people into thinking we're an evil country run by a bunch of terrible people, and all of our motives are designed to keep certain people down, all those ideas are basically designed to make people who live in the most successful country in the world feel like they're losing. If you're willing to play a long-term game, one of decades, 50 years, 100 years, you can do anything.
That is exactly what I was just going to say, because one thing I've talked about on the show, empires fell in the 20th century, but there are a lot of people who still want empires, who believe that their way of life is the only way of life that should control humanity. And they play the long game. Meanwhile, America, because we're a democracy, and part of being a democracy means your leaders change all the time, we are generally much more short-sighted in terms of the next step we're going to do. What will we do that will affect things a month from now, maybe a year from now, instead of a century from now, which granted is harder when you're a democracy. So it seems to me that American leaders have not been organizing a fight back.
Correct. And because we are too busy battling internally, we are taking our eye off the ball on the people who want to change the world order.
I had an analyst on the show, this guy in Egypt who's brilliant, and also he sees the Middle East as being divided between a moderate axis and an evil axis these days. And the evil axis he also calls the Iranian axis. And he says Qatar's in there too. So there is a reason that Iran and Qatar have invested so much in media. Qatar has its state-run propaganda channel, Al Jazeera. Iran has Press TV, IRNA. Some of the sources I use to look at what the mainstream media is saying, they include those as though they're legitimate sources. So people are regularly on their phones getting memes from those places. And those places end up having people who get hired in the actual mainstream news outlets who bring with them their strategies, their focus on creating memes. So it has spread through our news media ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree. You got to get people's attention. You got to feed them an idea. That idea has to pass with an ideology. You get people to think, oh, well, actually, that's not so bad. And you begin to boil a frog. And 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years later, they don't even know they're being boiled.
You wrote, the same memetic warfare that got us into this mess can help get us out. Through all the apps and platforms people use, the country must help people rediscover and unleash national pride. What you're saying here is that we can fight back with memetic warfare by getting memes out there that carry these important messages. Those memes, those messages should be what?
Well, we're talking about a very particular outcome, which is for people in this country to regain their pride and regain this sense of unity around being an American. And I would argue, going back to defining what it means to be American. What do we believe in as a people? And what does this country stand for? And counter some of the messaging about victimhood, about lack of fairness, that we have lost our way, all these things. Everyone's focused on the last thing, the last bill, the last whatever. We're lacking the core principles of what it means to be American in 2025.
When division helps people win, which it does, no doubt. Look at Trump. Instead of pretending I'm going to bring everybody together, like he never made that pretense. So in that kind of division, that is a way to political success currently on either side. Is it up to the rest of us as a social movement to start spreading core ideas about America through memes? Is it something that governments should be doing? Who will make this happen?
I think we all have a part to play in it. And I would hope that some of the powers that be, elected officials, et cetera, would realize that they can win and the country could lose. And it should not be a zero-sum game.
When we talk about the kinds of things that should be spread through the memetic process, it's things that are true. You're not saying, hey, let's pretend that there's no problems. Let's pretend we didn't have slavery. Let's pretend that there's no racism. We're saying, here's how we move forward. Or in America, people of all races and creeds have a better economic shot than they do in 99% of the world, or things like that. You still want to stick to truth.
100%. The truth does win eventually, right?
I hope so. That would be nice. Some thoughts on how we can try to make sure truth wins right after this. When people are radicalized by lies, whether from the far right or the far left, it can be tempting to get into debates with them, especially in this era of social media. You see somebody lying on a platform and you have this natural instinct to educate them or to argue with them. Unfortunately, that is almost always a waste of time. Radicalized people almost never get unradicalized, at least in the short term. That's why it makes news when it happens. The ex-Nazi, the ex-Islamist Nazi. But the good news is that there are huge numbers of people who are not radicalized, whose minds are open, who are ready to learn facts. I see that all the time in the responses I get to this show. So many people want truth. So one of the best things you can do is share this show with people who want to learn, people who may have heard lies and been exposed to all kinds of memes to spread propaganda, but whose minds have not been overtaken by them yet. The people out there with those open minds are one of the biggest inspirations for me to do this show. And when you share this with people you know, especially at a one-to-one level, and say, hey, I think you will get something out of this specific episode, for any of the episodes, that is impactful. And that fuels me to keep going. So thank you to everybody who has been doing that. Next week, I have something special for you. I'm going to be taking you on a journey to a place that I'm so psyched to tell you about. In the meantime, be in touch. There are two great ways to reach me. The best way is the newsletter. And the second is that there is a form at my website that anybody can fill out. It's a really cool form. You get your own unique code, and you'll find all that at joshlebs.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.